The exhausted Red Army continued to strike back at the invading Nazi behemoth as the third week of August began. The attacks had even begun to show signs of success in many places, but the middle of the month brought only more heartbreak, as counter-offensives stumbled and became operational pauses at best and devastating retreats at worst. We left off last week with the renewal of Army Group North's advance towards Leningrad and the stumbling of Vatutin's attack around Lake Ilmen. We also watched as Guderian began his turn south, and the Red Army struggled to fill the gaps in the line north of Kyiv. This week, we will cover the third week of August. We will track the Battle of Kyiv as it intensifies, and Guderian begins to drive behind the city to encircle the southwestern front. We'll cover the events of August 17th through 24th. Let's begin with a look at the air war on the Eastern Front, and how the Luftwaffe and VVS were managing thus far. Every week we release 3 new exclusive videos for our members and patrons. The Pacific War, the Eastern Front of World War II Prelude, and many other series, including the War of Spanish Succession, Punic Wars, Iberian Reconquista, Russian Revolution and Civil War, North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, and much more. It has been long overdue, but we have finally created a YouTube channel exclusively for our Kings and Generals podcasts. Please go and check out Kings and Generals podcast, home to the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, link in the description and pinned comment. To see those, as well as get access to our exclusive Discord, see our schedule, and get early access to all videos, join the ranks of our patrons and YouTube members via the links in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to our supporters for allowing us to continue doing our dream job. The VVS had suffered a crippling blow in June, and had only been able to operate throughout July because of its reserves of aircraft, and the inability of the Luftwaffe to cover the whole front. As August progressed, its strength started to trend upward. On the 7th of August, they had even managed a long-range bombing mission to Berlin. This mission was little more than a symbolic raid. Out of 15 bombers that started the raid, only 8 made it to the city, and their pathetically small loads did little damage. The second raid on August 10th garnered similar results. 26 bombers participated, 6 got to Berlin, and only 2 returned to base. Still, it was a sign of the growing strength of the VVS that a mission like this could be pulled off. The Luftwaffe had been unable to make good even the relatively mild losses of the first few weeks of the war. New production was being split among 3 theatres. The Mediterranean and Africa were demanding ever-increasing support as the Italians faltered, and the British stepped up attacks on Axis shipping. In Germany, the British Bomber Command had been striking industrial targets since the Battle of Britain. These raids did very little damage at this stage of the war. Only in 1942, when the combined bomber offensive was launched, did the raids begin to cause serious problems. Still, they were present and they were distracting. The Luftwaffe had to defend the homeland with fighters, flak installations, and other resources that could have been used elsewhere. On the Eastern Front, the struggle was intensifying as the Soviet Air Force managed to recover from the early shock. The army was demanding more air support across wider fronts than ever before. At the same time, as the front line advanced, the Air Corps were having to move squadrons further from their initial well-equipped bases. The forward airfields were rarely more than dirt strips, and the Luftwaffe struggled as much as the army did in supplying these forward elements. Spare parts, fuel, and even medical care for pilots and crew were hard to come by in the vast undeveloped areas they were being forced to operate in. For the assault on the approaches to Leningrad, the 1st and 8th Air Corps had been running non-stop missions for weeks by the 3rd week of August. They bombed VVS airfields, rail lines running into the city, provided close air support, and attempted to interdict Red Army concentrations. There were not enough planes or men to go around. Consequently, the effectiveness of all of these missions tended to suffer. The VVS was unable to make much of it though, struggling as they were. In Army Group Center, there was little Luftwaffe activity, as most of the 1st Air Fleet had been transferred either north or south to assist with Hitler's stated priorities of Kyiv and Leningrad. This did not mean that the VVS stood by idly. In the south, the 5th Air Corps tried to defend Kleist's panzers from the growing threat of Soviet air attacks. VVS pilots were brave and determined to cause damage, even with the odds stacked against them. Wehrmacht anti-aircraft artillery units helped to defend against these attacks, especially at the vital crossing points across the rivers. These bridges were the arteries that kept the Heer's combat power alive. Also, the bridges behind the Red Army allowed them an axis of retreat, and for the seemingly unending columns of reinforcements to arrive at the front. Serious resources were dedicated by both sides to deny the other the use of bridges, and air power was the primary means in doing so. As Army Group North continued its offensive towards Leningrad, some of the hardest fighting was around Velikiye. In episode 9 of this series, we talked about the drawn-out battle for the area during July. Hot had been preparing for a final battle since the beginning of August. The 3rd Panzer Group had been dedicated to clearing out the Red Army. For Hot's set-piece battle to retake Velikiye, he had the assistance of the 23rd Infantry Corps with 4 infantry divisions. He brought 3 of his panzer divisions to the fight, the 20th, 8th and 19th. Defending was Lieutenant General Ishakov's 22nd Army and the 48th Tank Division under Colonel Yakovlev. As the month progressed, Hot maneuvered his armor to the southeast of the city, taking advantage of a wedge he was able to form in the Soviet lines. This movement eventually cut the rail line to Rizhev, a critical line of supply and potential retreat for the 22nd Army. On August 22nd, Hot launched his attack. The fighting was vicious. General Stummer led the main panzer assault group, and it took him almost 3 entire days to break through to the east of the city and envelop the Soviet forces. Further north, the fighting around Lake Ilmen continued. On the 16th of August, the Germans retreated from Staraya Russia and Gorky. Vatutin's offensive was working, but there were signs that things were not going to stay in the Red Army's favour. As we covered last week, the terrain had hindered the Soviet advance, and communication issues were prevalent. Lieb had directed Manstein to come to the relief of the embattled 10th Infantry Corps. On the 19th of August, he was in place and began his counterattack. He attained complete surprise as the 3rd Motorized Infantry attacked on the left flank, and the SS Totenkopf attacked on the right. The Soviets fumbled the reaction, and Vatutin failed to properly coordinate the response. He watched helplessly as Manstein's counterattack pushed his men back. By the end of the week, it was clear that Vatutin could not hold his gains, and was back to his original starting point. The offensive had clearly weakened his positions. He had lost several thousand men. However, from a theatre-level view, it cannot be said that it was a total failure. True, Vatutin had not broken the advance of the Wehrmacht, nor had he regained substantial land. What his offensive had done was distract Army Group North from its true objective. Lieb had been conned into weakening the main effort. This violated Doctrine 101. The Schwerpunkt, or main effort, was supposed to be the sacred cow of the offensive. It could not be weakened or detracted from. In German doctrine, nothing mattered so much as the success of the Schwerpunkt. Leningrad was the strategic objective of Army Group North. Taking and holding the city was one of the 2 main objectives for which the entire campaign was supposed to turn on during this phase of operations. Lieb violated these dicta in order to protect his weakened southern flank. The forces under Manstein were taken out of the main effort and sent south to protect, at the time, a strategically meaningless line. It was clear that Vatutin did not have the forces necessary to effect a real breakout. Lieb's failure of command in this respect was a serious blow to the Wehrmacht's chances of successfully carrying out Hitler's demands that Leningrad be taken. The assault began to stall out, and the missing forces under Manstein might have proven the means to carry the fighting forward. Aside from Lieb's strategic stumbling, Army Group Center was desperately fighting its own battles of attrition that could decide the strategic outlook of the campaign in this area. The drama at the Yelna Salient was still continuing. Zhukov had the advantages of numbers, positioning and political backing for his attack. Bock had never agreed with Guderian's advance across the river in the first place. Army Group Center had also been weakened by the diversion of its panzer forces to its neighboring army groups. As commander of Army Group Center, he felt slighted by this diversion and made noise with the OKH and OKW about it. Moscow had been his objective from the beginning of the campaign, and he had constantly asked for more troops. Instead, after 2 of the largest encirclement battles in history and an unprecedented run of success in the advance to Smolensk, his army group had been neutered. Now he was stuck trying to defend a vulnerable salient in his lines that he never wanted. To make matters worse, Zhukov had been given this mission with absolute priority from the Stavka. He knew that if he failed, he would likely lose any influence, and possibly even his life. Just days ago, he had been the chief of staff for the Stavka, but his outspoken opposition to Stalin's refusal to evacuate Kyiv had gotten him dismissed. Now was his chance to save his reputation and his neck. He had been relentlessly hammering the salient for days now, and as the third week of August began, the Germans were feeling the wear and tear caused by the unending Soviet attacks. On August 21st, Zhukov was forced to finally pause his offensive at Yelna. He had exhausted his resources and needed time to get reinforcements in place. At the same time, Timoshenko was planning his own large counter-offensive to take place at the end of August. Together, the renewed forces under the Red Army's Western and Reserve fronts would attack the weakened Army Group Center at the end of August. The remainder of the month was essentially an operational pause by both sides, as they had spent the better part of 8 weeks battering each other non-stop. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group was the main attraction for the high commands of both sides. With his advancing panzers rested, Hitler's ambitions were to crush the Red Army in the south and seize the rich resources of the Ukrainian steppe. Stalin was desperately throwing men and material in the panzer leader's path, but to no real gain. Last week, the Bryansk front had been created with the specific intention of stopping Guderian. The now nearly destroyed Central Front was dissolved and its forces transferred to Eremenko's command. Gomel fell on August 19th. After the fall of that city, Army Group Center's southern flank was in much better condition than it had been just a week earlier. Another Soviet front had been effectively destroyed, and the line had been straightened. With the relatively easy success at Gomel, Hitler looked at his operational maps and decided that the best path forward was to order Guderian to attack further south again. This time, he wanted to envelop Kyiv from the rear, while Kleist's panzers attacked from the south of the city. Together, they could link up and destroy the overwhelming majority of the southwestern front. Many of the leading commanders of the Wehrmacht were against this course of action. The two loudest members of the opposition were Bock and Hellyer. These two had been staunch opponents of anything that detracted from the focus on Moscow from the earliest days of the campaign. The egos of the two men played at least as large a part as the strategic considerations of the war. They were blind to the economic needs of the war effort, something Hitler could not afford to be. Hellyer and Bock were wary to acknowledge that the thing they had staked their reputations on, that the capture of Moscow was the only way to win the war, was not the best path forward. Further, Bock was unwilling to see his command limited in order to allow for the success of the campaign. He saw that Guderian would manage to place the glory on his shoulders alone, and that was the last thing anyone in the Wehrmacht wanted. Still, Hitler was determined to have his way and would not be deterred by what he saw as the muling of the generals. If they had their way, not one of his accomplishments would have been achieved. Germany would still be mired in its depression, unwilling to conquer the enemy for fear of retribution. He alone had willed the war into being, and he alone had driven the Wehrmacht into Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, the Low Countries, France, and now the Soviet Union. His egomania was not yet at its peak, but Hitler was not going to be deterred by generals. He thought of himself as a chosen man, and a genius one at that. He was going to lead Germany to victory. The generals were mere tools. On August 19th, the same day Gomel fell, Eremenko managed to break into the rear areas of Schweppenberg's 24th Panzer Corps. Units from the Central Front's 45th Rifle Corps were wreaking havoc on the very limited supply lines of the panzers. Calling up Guderian's headquarters, he had to report that he would be unable to take the town of Novozhivkov on the Gomel line. This was an incredible admission of weakness for a panzer commander in 1941. It may well have been unprecedented. Schweppenberg did not have a reputation for timidity, but his men and vehicles were simply worn out. On the 20th, Guderian ordered him to resume his advance. In response, it was made clear the exact situation at the front line. The 3rd Panzer Division had essentially no fuel. The 10th Motorized Infantry had lost more trucks than they could count, and the 4th Panzer was not in place. The 4th Panzer was reporting that they were running on fumes, and that they had just 44 operational tanks. The non-stop campaigning was not just blunting the edge of the Wehrmacht's sword, it was destroying it. The 4th Panzer had started the campaign on June 22nd with 176 tanks. The last 7 weeks had seen the division reduced to just 25% of this. Clearly, the victories of the first weeks had taken their toll. Despite these difficulties, Hitler thought the time was right to strike south and envelop Kyiv. On August 23rd, he ordered that Guderian would strike Schweppenberg's 24th Panzer and the 47th Panzer Corps under Lemelsen and drive to a link-up with Kleist's 1st Panzer Group, which was attacking north from Kremenchuk. The 1st Panzer Group had been struggling to make serious progress. This had been part of the impetus behind using part of Guderian's force to help encircle Kyiv. It had been clear since late July that Army Group South was not up to the task of taking the city without serious assistance. On the 16th of August, Stalin had finally allowed the Fifth Army to pull back behind the Dnieper River. The Fifth Army had fought hard and given the Germans more than a fair fight, all things considered. Still, the southwestern front was tottering. On the opening day of Operation Barbarossa, Kipanos had been in possession of the strongest armoured force in the world. Originally, there were 8 mechanized corps and 4,400 tanks in his front's order of battle. Now, just 8 weeks later, he only had 1 weak division left. The 32nd Tank Division was the only reserve force in the entire region that had any mobility to speak of. The entire front was worn out. The southwestern front still had reasonably strong defensive lines, and the ability to make the infantry of Army Group South pay for every inch of ground they took. The danger to the front was not from a collapse of the front lines. By now, even the weakest Red Army units were not susceptible to the kind of dissolution that could be expected in the earliest days. The men were becoming veterans, and the possibility of winning battles was very real. Every front had seen the weakness of the Germans firsthand. The invaders could be defeated man to man. Yet the key factor to every battle thus far had been the mobile forces. If the armour and mounted infantry could stay nimble, then victory was on the table. Here was the rub. As overstretched as the Germans were becoming, they were still able to field multiple corps-sized combined arms teams that possessed strong mobility. The Red Army could not match this. There were still more tanks in the Soviet inventory than were in the German, but it was the fielding of these in cohesive units with experienced commanders and strong strategic direction that was lacking. Until this could be remedied, the situation could never be redeemed. Time would tell if and when the Soviets would be able to do this. Next week, we will continue the week-by-week account of the entire war on the Eastern Front. From July 1941 to May of 1945, we will track the war's progress. Stay tuned, and remember, this is just the beginning of the weekly Eastern Front of World War II series. Don't forget to subscribe, comment and share this video. It helps immensely. We have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.